William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was born April 23rd, 1564, died April 23rd, 1616, at the age of 52. Now, even though his birth date is reported to be April 23rd, back in those days they weren't necessarily born on the 23rd. It may have been the day he was christened, which would have been 3 to 7 days within his birth date. So he could have been born April 20th, he could have been slightly before that, or a little bit later. It's hard to say. But those are the reported birth dates. April 23rd, 1564, and died April 23rd, 1616. So he died on the same day he was born, theoretically. So why would we talk about William Shakespeare? What makes him different than any other playwright? Shakespeare is probably considered the greatest playwright of all times, partly because of the type of plays he wrote, the style in which he wrote, and the fact that they've lasted well over 450 years. So, a little bit about Shakespeare. Shakespeare was also an actor. He was known for doing acting and for playwriting and writing sonnets. There is some controversy about Shakespeare, which I'll get into later. But basically, the man known as William Shakespeare was an actor, playwright, and wrote sonnets, which sonnets is kind of a poetry type thing. He married an actress named Anne Hathaway. It's not the Anne Hathaway you're thinking of today, although she probably is some relation of some sort. They had 3 children, Susanna, Judith, and Hamnet, and Judith and Hamnet were twins. Shakespeare was considered an Elizabethan playwright, even though most of his major work took place during the Jacobean era. So Elizabethan, that's Queen Elizabeth, and then Jacobean, that's King Jacob during those times. Most of his plays are based on other plays or histories or poems. So, for instance, Romeo and Juliet, the play Romeo and Juliet, is not something that originated with Shakespeare, at least not in the storyline. He may have originated the style in which he told the play in, that language that he used, but the story itself was something that was told down through the ages, over and over again, repeated and told. There's a movie that came out a few years back called Tristan and Isolde. Tristan and Isolde is basically the same story as Romeo and Juliet. It also, in America, we have a story called The Hatfields and the McCoys. Basic same story. So most of his plays, even though he wrote the plays, the stories did not originate with him. That's not to say all of them, but some of the stories did not originate with Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's time, theaters had no curtain and used little or no scenery. So the playwrights described the setting within the text of the performance. And this is one of the reasons why we find it hard to watch or listen to or read Shakespeare, because he's very didactic, meaning he puts a lot of extra information in, and most of that is based on seeing what we see. So for instance, in Romeo and Juliet, when we first see Juliet's nurse come on stage, he describes her in detail in the dialogue so that you know what she looks like based on what they're saying. Now, the fact that we ourselves have a very visual society today, we don't need as much of that, because we're probably going to get that through our own means, as far as seeing it and or using scenery or costumes or props, and the way the actors look, they'll be cast to look the way they're supposed to look. All that kind of stuff is taken into account more so today. Shakespeare wrote at least 37 plays in 3 different categories. There are some plays that are attributed to Shakespeare that we have no proof that he had anything to do with, because they were either written or published after he had already died. So we count 37 as his main number of plays. He wrote historical plays, Henry V, Richard III. He wrote comedies, A Midsummer Night's Dream, All's Well That Ends Well, and tragedies, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth. He also wrote over 158 sonnets, plus other poetry. Most common one that you would have heard of is sonnet number 18, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, for thou art more lovely than whatever. Now, something you may not have known is that Shakespeare used a lot of language that didn't exist before Shakespeare. So certain words and phrases that are out there did not exist before Shakespeare, such as the word critical. The word critical had never existed, never been printed, never been used to our knowledge before Shakespeare. The word frugal, excellent, barefaced, assassination, countless. These are all words attributed to Shakespeare. That means that those words, again, had never been uttered or written or printed before they showed up in a work that Shakespeare wrote. Some phrases that first occurred in his writings: one fell swoop, vanish into thin air, play fast and loose, be in a pickle, foul play, tower of strength, flesh and blood, be cruel to be kind, with bated breath. So a lot of these are phrases that we use commonplace, maybe not as much today as a couple generations ago, but some of these are very much things we've heard of or seen in other movies and books. So an interesting fact about Shakespeare: according to the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, Shakespeare wrote about 1/10 of the most quotable quotations ever written or spoken in English. So in other words, 1 out of 10 quotes theoretically comes from Shakespeare. So now let's get to the controversy with Shakespeare. So we know that there was a man named William Shakespeare who was an actor who was attributed to being the playwright and the guy who wrote the sonnets. The question came up in the 1850s, so well over 200 years after Shakespeare's death, 250 years, give or take. The question came up, was the actor known as William Shakespeare actually the person who wrote all these plays? And the person, it was a lady that created this controversy. She basically gave several reasons why this person named William Shakespeare could not have been the person who wrote all these plays. So in no particular order, here are at least 4 of the things that they came up with that decided, hey, there's no way this could have been the guy that did it. So of the 4 things, here's one of them. Shakespeare, the man known as Shakespeare, was uneducated. There's no records of him having ever gone beyond what we would consider an elementary level education today. So there's no school records existing showing that he actually attended school and or was successful in school. The man known as William Shakespeare never left his small town until he started becoming famous. So there's no records of him ever having gone outside of his little town and traveled. So he wasn't worldly enough to have been somebody who could have wrote all these plays. Because how would he have known these great worldly stories that existed, that still exist and still successful today, if he never really experienced the world? Too many good works to have come from one person. So according to this argument, Shakespeare has too many good works if you think about Hamlet, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer Night's Dream, Henry IV, Richard III, all these plays, there's too many good ones to have come from one single person. So based on this argument, these plays were not written by one person, they were written by multiple people. So the idea was that either other contemporaries of Shakespeare, like Ben Jonson or Thomas Kidd or somebody along those lines, must have came along and wrote some of these and just used the pseudonym Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, and giving the actor William Shakespeare the credit for having wrote these. Okay. Now the big one. The average vocabulary of a person today, in our world today, the average vocabulary of any one particular person is 5,000 words. That means if you're speaking or writing, you are going to use no more than 5,000 words. Okay? Doesn't mean you don't know more than that, but you're typically not going to write or say more than 5,000 words. In all the works of Shakespeare, in all of his 37 plays and 150 sonnets, Shakespeare used over 35,000 words. So based on that, the vocabulary, it could not have been somebody that could have wrote all these plays. It would have had to been multiple people. Now, these all sound like good ideas, good arguments. Keep in mind that these arguments started well over 150 years after his death. So he died in 1616. These arguments came out in 1850. So actually 250 years almost. But with all these different, and these are just four, there were at least 14, 15 different arguments against him being the person who wrote the plays. Even somebody like Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, the writer and humorist, he believed that this argument was true as well, at least at some point. But now I'm going to knock down why these arguments may or may not be just. For instance, uneducated. No records of him having gone beyond elementary level education. He died in 1616. That means by the time he got out of elementary school, it was still in the 1500s. There's no way. What are the odds that those records would still exist? They're not on a computer anywhere. They're not been digitized. They would have been hard records on paper. Chances are they would have rotted away or been burned in a fire or something along the way. Why would they keep somebody's records from school? By the time he died, those records are no good, theoretically. I mean, I don't know that I could probably go back to my high school level and get records of me, only because they've probably been put on computers since then. But back in the 1500s, they had no way of doing it, so there probably would have been very few records of it. I doubt that they had more than one or two duplicates of those records, because they would have had to do them by hand. They did not have the means to mass produce those. Why would they mass produce the records of those anyway? So that's probably not going to be a good argument, because by the 1850s, there's the chances of those records even existing, and even if they still existed, try to find them. That would have been impossible. Having never left a small town, how would they know that? If he lived in a small town and he wasn't right on top of his next door neighbor, meaning they didn't live in some kind of apartment type complex or something like that. But even if that's the case, I could pick up and leave and not be seen for a week and nobody know that I've either left or stayed at home. They wouldn't know the difference. Depending on what time of the day or night I left, I could have gone and came and went and nobody would even know it. So to say that he never left a small town, again, what are the records? Now, this argument was basically based on the fact that he was supposedly well known, and that if he was well known or well off, they would have had records of in the newspaper. The newspapers would have reported when somebody well known or rich had left or come to town. So the idea is that if he had left his little small town and went to London, then when he reached London, there would have been record of it in the newspapers at the time. That, hey, William Shakespeare has just attended. Now, but that's to say that he was well known or wealthy before he was famous for being an actor and or playwright. So there's no, again, the fact that there are no records of him having left his small town, that means nothing, because he could have came and gone without anybody knowing it, because he was, even though he had some money, he was not necessarily wealthy. He was just well off, and he would not have been famous before he started writing all these plays and or started acting. Too many good works to have come from one person. What are we really saying here? Too many works. So they're saying they had too many good plays to have come from one person. Well, that same argument could be used for Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, Neil Simon. Over in other realms of literature, Stephen King, J.R.R. Gurney, or J.R.R. Tolkien. There's all kinds. All types of playwrights are other writers who have written lots of good works. So to say that too many good works from one person, that's debatable. Now the big one. Average vocabulary of 5,000 words. Shakespeare used over 35,000 words in all of his works. So according to this argument, if you were going to say that it takes more than one person to have written all these works in order to get more than 5,000 words in there, the problem with this argument is it would take well over 1,000 persons or people to do this, because if you take any 5 people with a vocabulary of 5,000 words each, the problem with the argument is, so yeah, if I have, let's say 7 people, so 7 people have a vocabulary of 5,000 words would give me my 35,000 words that I need in order for it to be Shakespeare. The problem with that argument is each one of these 5,000 words that these 5 or 7 individuals know, what are the odds that about 4,900 of them overlap? So you're really not getting 5,000 words, individual different words from 7 different people. You're getting maybe 100 different words from different people, which means it's going to take that many more people, probably from all different kinds of worlds, different locations, cultures, to get that many words. What they are not taking into consideration is the fact that Shakespeare created a lot of his own words. And when you have free reign to create all the words you want, it would not be that hard to create several thousand words over a lifetime. Now, something else that they're not taking into consideration is the fact that Shakespeare, during the time that he was born and lived, 1564 was when he was born, right? So in 1564, just a few, not even 50 years before he was born, there were 2 major events that took place in society. One was the Reformation. So in the religious realm, the Reformation was with Martin Luther, who was a monk, a Catholic monk, who basically had a difference of opinion, so to speak, of what the Bible was saying and or how it was being translated by the Catholics at the time to the people. And the Luther basically believed that the Bible should be something that anybody, any one person, doesn't matter their education level, should be able to read on their own and translate on their own. So he wrote a thing called the 95 Thesis. This thesis, he went and pinned it up on tacked it to the door of Wittenberg, the college, And that would be, by doing that, that created a challenge to the Catholic diocese. So basically, what he did was he challenged the Catholic Church, and then they therefore called him on the challenge, and he had to go defend his 95 thesis in front of the church. This is what started what we call the Reformation, and this is what separated the church from the Catholic Church to now you have the Catholic Church and then you have the Protestant churches. So from the Protestants you get your Baptist and your Catholic, or not your Catholics, but your Baptists and your Methodist and all these other different denominations, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, all these different denominations started from basically from the Reformation. So we know that that was significant for Shakespeare because in Shakespeare's plays, especially in something like Hamlet, you see the arguments based on Catholicism of the time and based on the Protestant movement of the time, which would have still been young. You can see the arguments and the questions arise throughout Hamlet in different ways. So that was definitely something. In fact, Hamlet went to Wittenberg. That was the school he went to. Now, the other thing that took place in that time period that was very significant for Shakespeare was the printing press. So the first book that was printed was the Gutenberg Bible. Shortly after that, you had the Geneva Bible and some other things. So having been one of the first generations within 50-something years of the printing press, basically Shakespeare was one of the first generations. And keep in mind, his parents were affluent. They had a little bit of money. They weren't necessarily the wealthiest people in the world, but they weren't poor either. They could afford to get him books, and Shakespeare loved to read books. So he was able to read stories about places and things that had never been printed before because now they have the printing press and they're able to do this. So the only way they could have been printed before that is by hand, somebody writing it by hand, and that would have took forever to make one copy, let alone 2 or 3 copies. Now they can make hundreds of copies. So Shakespeare was one of the first generations to be able to utilize the full extent of the printing press, which would allow him to become more worldly and not have to have left his small town, per se. Now, the other argument about that is you could also say that to be more worldly, just because he never supposedly left his own little town, doesn't mean that other people didn't come to his town and he didn't go and listen to what they had to say and listen to them tell stories, and then he absorbed those stories and then made them his own. All of that is possible. All this being said is there's more evidence that the man known as William Shakespeare, who is accredited for having written all these great plays and poetry and sonnets, there's more evidence that he did do it than there is evidence that he did not do it. Okay, but you can take that and you can go with it either way you want. The biggest thing that you need to know is William Shakespeare, the playwright, whether it was one person or multiple people, wrote some great plays that still exist and are still just as relevant today as they were 450 years ago.